All right. Here we go. Good evening, gentlemen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening, braving the winter tundra to join us. God willing, even though Kislev is a cold month, it's also a very Chassidish month. And God willing, the light and the warmth of Chassidus will warm us up, will keep us warm. We've been discussing over our previous classes a very profound teaching of Chassidus. The teaching is that Ani Havaya Lo Shanisi, I, God, have not changed, which means that God is exactly the same after He creates the world as He is before He creates the world. God as He exists now, when there's a whole universe and all the spiritual realities, is no different than God as He was before He created anything. God as He is unto Himself. The question, of course, and we spent all of last week just trying to understand the question is, how can this be? How can it be that God truly isn't changed by any of His creations, by any of the ulamas, any of the worlds, anything that He creates? The question is not, as we discussed at length last week, the question is not a question if you believe God is not closely involved in the creation and constant involvement in each and everything in the universe. In other words, if a person believes that the universe just comes about, or the universe is created without a process, without God's direct involvement, the universe comes about in some way that we don't understand, but it doesn't involve God's direct and close involvement. It doesn't involve a process in which God is engaged to create the universe, then really it's not a question. You have a universe, you have all different worlds, all different realities that come forth from God, and none of those realities change God, because the truth is why would they change God? We don't know anything about the process by which the universe comes about. If there's no process, nothing we can understand about how the universe comes about, how would we even be able to posit that it causes any change to God? Why would it change Him at all? That is not our question. Our question is, if God creates the world as the Torah seems to describe, if God creates everything by speaking it into existence through a process, that there is God and then there is the thing that is created, but there is a process in which God is involved to create, how is it that even though God is involved, and even though God is involved differently for different things, one world God is involved in creating one way, a different world in a different way. He says Yehi and He says Yehi Rakia. He's involved in creating this one thing in a different way than He's involved in creating a second thing, or bringing forth a second thing. And even though He is actively involved, He is involved in a process to bring all of these different things into existence. And before the universe was created, He was not involved in any such process, it would seem. Nevertheless, we are taught, Ani Havaya Lo Shanisi, I, God, have not changed. And we began to give an answer last week. The truth is last week was wholly devoted to the question, because the answer we gave last week was really just the very short summary of the answer, which we didn't explain at all, so we didn't really answer last week. But we began to explain last week that really the differences and the different processes and the finite things in which God is involved, this process in which God is involved to bring everything, each thing into existence, all these different processes, right? For example, Yehi let there be light is one process, Yehi Rakia, let there be a firmament is a second, and a different process, for example, right? The Rebbe Rashab's example was all the different worlds, right? One process brings about Atzilus, and a different one brings out Bria. The differences in these processes, the changes, the distinctions that make one process different from each other and every process different from God, so to speak, none of these changes are the opposite or contradict God's unity. In other words, when we say God is unchanging, these changes are not the opposite of that unchanging. In other words, God is unchanging in a way that if he changed, it wouldn't look like the various processes that we are calling change, right? The change that would be a true change to God is not what he is doing when he is involving himself in all these different individual processes and creating a universe. We didn't explain how that can be. We just said that that's the answer. And we said that when you understand this, really all of these changes are only from the perspective of the Mekabel. All of these changes are only legabeinu, are only from our perspective does it seem that there are all of these changes. Only from our perspective does it seem that Yehi and Yehi Rakia, or the worlds of Atzilus and the world of Bria, are different and distinct, that these are changes. From God's perspective, even God, as he is actively involved in creating all these different things, there's no change. That's what we said last week. The change is only from the perspective of the separate things that are created from Hashem. From God's perspective, when he looks at him saying Yehir and Yehi Rakia, or he looks at himself creating the world of Atzilus versus creating the world of Bria, from God's perspective, these things, none of these things contradict his unchangingness. He is exactly as he was before he did all of these things, and none of these things is distinct from another. I would like to continue. We're going to read tonight. We're going to see how the Rebbe explains this. And we're going to explain as we go. We are in the Hebrew on page Lamed Zayin. About halfway down the page, the line starts Ukumasha Kosov. See where I am? Line starts Ukumasha Kosov as Hashemayim as Aretani Male. Yes? That's where we are. It's almost exactly halfway down the page. Kumasha Kasu, as the verse says, Es Hashemayim ves Aretz ani malei, the heaven and the earth I fill. Continuing on the theme that we read last week, that to God, kechashecha, ke'era, darkness and light are absolutely the same, which means that the change and God before he changes are exactly the same to God. Really, there is no change here from the perspective of God. And the last thing we read was Einei Shayach Shum Tzimtzum V'Ester Chas V'Shalom. To God, to the Infinite One himself, there is no such thing as a contraction and a concealment from his perspective. And so too, the verse says, the heaven and the earth I fill. The entire earth is full of God's glory. It is only possible when you are talking about concealment for something that is other to conceal. This is the beginning of our answer. This is really the first step, the first thing you have to understand. The answer is in multiple parts. So you have to, as we say in Yiddish, halt kop. You have to follow. You have to put in an effort to follow how the Rebbe Rashab goes through the various steps of this response, and really it continues throughout the whole mimer. In other words, the full answer will only be in a lot of time. We're going to get there slowly. But this is the first step. The first thing you have to understand is that when you are talking about concealment, only a zulas means the other, right? Only something else can conceal. Aval etzem einay shayach sheyaster al atzmo. But a self cannot conceal itself. In fact, it doesn't even make sense to talk about a self concealing itself. Just like you cannot say a person conceals themselves. As is written in the Code of Jewish Law, Orach Chaim, in the first section dealing with daily halacha in daily life, Siman Tzadik Aleph, chapter 91, Le'inyan kisui haresh, regarding the covering of one's head. What's the halacha? It does not help for a person to put their hands on their head. If you put your hands on your head, it doesn't count as a yarmulke. Why? Because a self cannot conceal a self. In other words, there is a concept of kisui haresh. The head has to be covered. Now the question is, as we ask about everything in halacha, is what does that mean? And as is the halachic tradition, right, as we do in the Talmud and in the codes of Jewish law, we push that to its furthest distances, right? We ask about all sorts of things. What counts as a cover? But there's a principle that you cannot call your own hand or a part of your own body a covering for your head, which is interesting. Because if you think about it, your hands are not your head, right? In other words, if it was possible, if I can consider my hand and my head two distinct things, right? Which they are. My hand is not my head, right? A head is not a hand. Why is the halacha that I can't put my hand on my head and call it a yarmulke? And the reason is because it's not a din in head versus hand. In other words, it's not a question of whether the hand is a different thing than the head. It's a din in etzem enei master al etzem. It's a din, it's a law, it's a legal principle of it cannot be considered a covering if it's of the same self. Even though the hand and the head are not the same, a hand is not a head, right? If they're of the same self, you can't call it concealment, right? So in other words, it has to be a covering of the head dafka, and covering, it has to specifically be a covering, and implicit in the very definition of covering is the idea that it's not of the same etzem, it's not of the same self, right?
Covering your head,
yeah.
Is that like a symbol of covering yourself? I mean, why only the head?
What do you mean?
Some people take a small yarmulke, they put it on their head, and they have a kippah.
Yeah.
So why does it important that? I know it's called kisui rosh.
Yeah.
But why?
You're saying what's the meaning behind wearing a yarmulke? Is that what you're asking me?
I know that. This is rabbinical. It's not from the Torah.
Right.
And some people even wear it like double layer. So it's for the God you know, for God you don't.
Yeah. So what's the question?
The question is, why really can't you put your hand? It's like you're covering.
Because it's not a covering. Your hand is a covering on someone else's head. You can put your hand on someone else's head as a yarmulke. It's not a covering on your own head. Why? Because it's part of yourself. That's exactly the point. It's part of yourself. Your hand does not work because it's not really considered halachically a covering if it's from the same self. Why not? Why not?
Again, why is covering your head is actually covering yourself?
Say again?
Even you wearing yarmulke, why is covering your head is actually covering yourself?
It's not covering yourself.
It's not. It's not from the same self. When I say it's from the self, I mean it can't be from the same self. It can't be from the same thing or the same person. Yeah.
Okay.
So in other words, covering your head is not covering your whole self. That's not what we're saying at all. That's not what we're saying. We're saying that all that needs to be covered is the head. We're not talking about covering the self. But what can't you use as a cover at all? Not just in this context. There's no such thing as covering with a part of yourself. There is no such thing. For example, I'll give you a different example, which maybe will help you better.
From yourself.
I'll give you a different example, which is a better example.
Of course.
I think or maybe a more easily understood example, I should say, from I think it's from the Zohar, if I'm not mistaken. It's not from the Zohar, it's from another Sefer Kabbalah. Unfortunately, it's slipping my mind at the moment where exactly it's from. But the examples given is of like a tortoise or a snail, right? That they conceal themselves in their own shell, right? Now, of course, if you know how the tortoise's anatomy, the shell is not a different part of the tortoise, right? Or so too with snails, where the shell is part of the snail. I don't know, I'm not a zoologist, so you're going to have to... I'm not even sure how the word is correctly translated, actually. Maybe there might be some debate on that as well. Let's say a tortoise, right? You have a tortoise. So if a tortoise hides in its shell, right? It pulls its arms and its legs and its head in, and all that you see there is a shell, right? The shell is part of the tortoise. You can't say the tortoise is hiding. It's not hiding. I'm looking right as its shell. It's not covered. It's not concealed. The tortoise is here, right? All I'm looking at is the tortoise. You can't conceal yourself with yourself, because whenever anybody looks at that concealment, what will they say? They'll say, that's not a concealment, that's you. I can see you from there. That's not a covering. That's not a conceal. It's not covered, right? It's not covered, it's a self.
In that case, if somebody is wearing a wig,
Yeah.
is he covered? Nobody sees that he's covered.
Yeah, but the wig is not from his same atzem. It's not about fooling the other person. That's not the idea. The point is, what are you looking at bepel? What am I actually looking at? If you cover your head with a wig, I'm bepel, not looking at you. I'm looking at some object that is not you on your head.
Give me even a better example.
Okay, give me a better example.
You take some of your hair, you cut it, and then you put it in yourself.
I don't know. That's a very good halachic question. Why do you have to cut it?
Because you lost your kippah.
Why doesn't your hair count normally?
Because if it's connected like a sukkah, if it's connected to the sukkah, then it's part of the sukkah, and it's not right. It has to be something which is extra.
Why?
Like you cannot take a bush and put it on the sukkah if it's connected to the earth. So you cut it, and then you put
You're telling me because it's growing on my head, so it's makabel tuma, like schach? I don't know about that. I don't know about that halachic reasoning.
No, because it's part of you as long as it grows on your head.
No
When you
kidding.
cut
That's what I'm trying to say is that everyone agrees with me. I don't know what we're having issues with exactly. I don't know about your halachic question about cutting off your own hair and using it as a yarmulke. It's an interesting halachic question. I have no idea. No idea. So, a self cannot conceal a self. Why is this important? Why is this principle important? The Rebbe continues and he says, Ulamaila, above, in other words, by God, talking about godliness, Harei ein lecha davar shechutz mimenu. When you're talking about God, the truth is that there is nothing that's actually outside of him. In other words, when you're talking about God's creation, right? Again, what's our question? Let's remember, because now we've gone too far, we've forgotten the question already. What's our question? Our question is, God is actively involved in creating different things, right? Through different processes. Let's say Yehi Yehi Rakia, right? On the first day he says, let there be light. On the second day he says, let there be a Rakia, a firmament. Light and firmament are two different things, and there's two different processes to create them. There's one utterance and a different utterance. Different statement of God each day, a different process by which these things are created. Our question is, if God is involved in two different things, how can you say that he doesn't change? How can you say that these two things are the same as each other and the same as what God was doing before he involved himself in any process? And the answer is, or the first step of the answer is, we should say, so as not to get too, too optimistic. The first step of the answer is that when God is concealing himself in this process, now you have to remember that concealment and change in this context is the exact same thing, right? We spoke about this last week as well. That when we talk about concealment and change are the same thing, right? We said it has to do with the nature of dibur, right? Which we're going to get more into as we go further, by the way. There will have more to say about dibur. But the nature of speech, of the divine speech, the whole reason we call it speech, this process that God is using to create things, right? The process is called speech because speech is a self-expression that's made for the other, that goes outward, right? So speech, change and concealment, right? Concealment being the place where it seems God is not, which is the other, and change, which is the process of speech by which he is creating that thing. These two things are very connected, right? I'm just trying to remind you of what we learned last week. That in this context, change and concealment are the same. You have God who is revealed and unchanging, and then through this process, he changes something, allegedly, and he becomes concealed. And we are saying, Ani Havaya Lo Shanisi, the thing we're trying to explain, means that actually he's not concealed and nothing changes. Right? I'm just trying to summarize, gather the ideas together, remind you from last week, right? So, he is unconcealed and unchanging. The first step of the explanation of how this is possible is because when God changes and conceals himself, which are the same thing for our purposes, more or less, the change and the concealment all is part of his etzem. It's all an expression of his very self. In other words, even though a hand and a head might be different in some way, right? Even though when I put my hand on my head, or the shell of the tortoise and the head of the tortoise, if you like that mashal, if you like that metaphor, even though they are different in important ways. For example, the tortoise doesn't think with its shell, it thinks with its head. Right? So there is a difference, right? In the sense of, and only in the sense of, this is just the first step, in only the sense of, is the tortoise hiding when it's within its shell? Is the tortoise hiding, right, when it's in its shell? The answer is no. The tortoise can't hide in its shell. Why? Because the shell is also the tortoise. The shell is also the tortoise. Just like a head can't hide under your own hand, right? If the purpose is to hide yourself, so to speak, to cover myself in any way, right? In other words, from the perspective of above, let's say I'm looking at a person from above at the bald spot, right on top, right? And they put their hand on top of it. Is the person concealed? Not is the bald spot concealed. That's another interesting question. That's a different question. Is the person concealed? Because the hand is, when I see the hand instead of the bald spot, do you see tzvi any less? The answer is no. Tzvi is equally in the bald spot and in the hand. It's one etzem. It's one self, right? The exact same thing above. The exact same thing above. God's process by which he is changing and concealing himself in order to, the process in which he's involved in all of these different things, to make all the different things in our universe and all the different worlds and all the different realities, all of these distinctions, what is it that he is concealing himself with? The answer is he's concealing himself with himself, right? Like the tortoise in its shell. It's only himself he's using to conceal himself. Why is that important? Why is that important that it's only himself he's using to conceal himself? Let's read further. The Rebbe is going to explain it to us.
No, it's very confusing.
Why?
Because you call it kisui rosh.
Yeah.
That means you need to cover your head.
Yeah.
That means if you put your hand over your head, you are covering your head.
Yeah, but the thing is, as I tried to explain...
No, I understood what you're saying. So why is it should have been called kisui, not kisui rosh? If you put kisui, then you cannot put
Because
yourself
it's kisui, because it's the rosh that has to be kasui.
But in that case, you put kisui.
But you can't kisui with your own etzem. It's not a din. That's what I tried to explain at the beginning.
No,
it's not a din in the head that you can't use the hand. If it was just a din in the head, I'm trying to speak to you in Gemara language, right? If we were just talking that the head, if it's just that the head should have something on it, you could theoretically use your hand. The thing is that because it has to be called a concealment, you can't use your own hand.
So it's not a simple kisui rosh. It's like, kisui rosh, which is not yourself.
What do you know? Kisui, by any definition, can't be with yourself. That's what we're saying.
But it's like kisui rosh.
Yes, it's a rosh that has to have a... I don't understand.
If it rains and you put your hand over your head,
Yes.
your head is not going to get wet. You're covering your head.
Right. Right.
So why it cannot be?
No, because it's not. That's not a halachic kisui. That's not a halachic kisui. We don't define kisui by whether the thing that is being concealed gets wet in the rain. We define it, but one of the conditions is it has to be from a different etzem. Just telling you the way it is. A kisui means if you want to say it's really covered, it has to be from something that's not of the same etzem. That's what we're saying. Different definition.
I don't want to be hard to the hip.
No.
The way the halacha is, and if you study the Gemara, you'll figure out why.
In other words,
All the reasons
this is the
that-
principle. The principle is that the person, because the point is, El, it does cover the head. You're right. I understand why you're confused. We're not talking about the head being covered. The head being covered is just an example of the halacha using this svara. But you're right. The head technically is covered, right? But Eyal is not covered. That's the point. That's actually what we're discussing. That's why this whole head covering thing is just a distraction. It's not really it's not the ikar here.
Not about kisui, but
Yeah.
it says, by the bear. Hashem the bear.
Yeah.
In order for somebody to speak, there has to be somebody that's going to listen.
Yeah.
Otherwise, what it is the purpose and the meaning of speaking?
Yeah.
It's a metaphor. It's a metaphor.
Yeah.
It's a metaphor.
Yeah.
So
I had hoped we had answered this question already. We've had this question previously. We had this question a few classes ago, and the answer is that it's different. When we say God is speaking, we mean that the speaking itself is what creates the zulas. The fact that it's directed towards someone is itself what creates that person. We're not talking about the speech to a person that already exists. We're talking about the speech that is magdir, right, and ultimately mahave, the makabel of the dibur. It's a different type of speech. It's not a speech to a thing that already exists. It's a speech that, because God is different, God speaks in a way as if it's to something outside of him that exists, and that's what creates the thing outside of him that
that's the
exists.
thing. To us, it
Yeah.
looks as if he speaks. For him,
Yeah.
nothing changes.
Oh, that's what we're trying to explain.
Right. So
Exactly.
in that case, what is the meaning of speaking if for him it doesn't make any change?
Oh, it's a very
And we
good.
do not exist.
That's a very good question. So we're not saying he's not speaking. We're saying he's doing something, and it's significant, and he does create everything.
For others,
No.
for him, it's not significant at all.
No, I didn't, we haven't.
Of course
said-
it
We
is.
haven't
No,
got there.
it
We
didn't
haven't got
change.
there. We haven't really
It
talked
doesn't mean
about.
it has no significance.
We haven't defined anything yet, but I'm glad that's the question, Al. That's the question. That's what we're trying to understand. Says the Rebbe, he says the next words. He says, so there is nothing that conceals God. V'havaya ve'elikim kul echad. And Havaya and Elokim, the two names of God, are really one, which is a very famous statement of the Kabbalah, that the two different names of God, Havaya and Elokim, the four-letter name and the name Elokim, are really one. How are we explaining this in our context? There's different ways of explaining this phrase. Havaya ve'Elokim kul echad. What do we mean by that? We already defined Havaya and Elokim in previous classes. Havaya, the four-letter name of Hashem, describes Hashem before he descends to speak anything into existence, before he involves himself in this process. And then Elokim is the process in which he involves himself. We've been speaking of it mostly as speech, right, as our metaphor. He's involving himself in speech to create, right? The Kabbalah teaches us Havaya ve'Elokim kul echad. Havaya and Elokim are absolutely one. Now there's whole long and intricate maimarim explaining this phrase itself. So in other words, if we got stopped here just trying to fully understand this phrase, it would take the place of the rest of our maimar, right? But we are explaining it here in a more limited sense. In other words, we're not explaining the whole maimar's worth about Havaya and Elokim kul echad. We are bringing up Havaya and Elokim kul echad for an obvious reason. When we say Hashem Hashem as what he is doing before he speaks, and Hashem when he speaks are absolutely one, we mean to say, in the same way we've been describing, that ein etzem master al etzem, a self cannot conceal itself. In other words, Havaya and Elokim, this is really the fundamental, this is the starting point. The starting point is that you are not talking, God forbid, about two different gods when you're describing Havaya and Elokim. God forbid, right? You're not talking about two different beings with these two different names. You're talking about one God, right? There's just two different, what do you want to call it, two different states that God can be in. There's God as he is before he begins speaking, right? When he's not saying anything to create something outside of himself, right? Or making any of these chilukim between Ur and Rakia, for example, making any of these distinctions between all of the different creations in the different worlds, etc. That's Havaya.
Is it states or expressions?
What?
Expressions.
There's different ways. There's different ways. There's different ways. There's different ways of translating. The reason I'm saying states is because I don't want to get bogged down and overcomplicate it. Right? There's two different states. There's God as he does, two different things. The names describe different behaviors of Hashem. Now, that itself is something that, again, you need whole maimarim to understand what that means exactly, but it doesn't matter for our purposes. It's beyond our pay grade, right? So I'm just describing it in the simplest way that I know how. The simplest way that I know how is you have God as he's doing two different things. You have God at rest, so to speak, whatever that means, right? And you have God not at rest, it sounds like a physics class, right? But God as he's speaking each and everything into existence. This is Havaya and Elokim. And rest assured, it's infinitely more complicated than what I'm describing. As always, right? We're simple people. We're trying to understand it at the simplest possible understanding. That's still correct, right? So you have Havaya and Elokim, Kulachad. What does it mean? It means God when he is not speaking, and God when he is speaking. Where do they both come from equally? They both come from one God. In other words, here's the fundamental teaching of the first step. The fundamental teaching is that even though we look at and we describe and we understand one of these things as God as he is revealed and authentically, so to speak, and one as God involves himself in a process to create the other, right, which is not God as he was authentically before he began to speak, but rather God as he is involved in something outside of himself, right? Nevertheless, these two things neither one of these two things can possibly be more godly than the other. Not that there's no difference between them, Eyal. There's a difference between a head and a hand, right? The head in this case being Havaya and the hand being Elokim, right? You have the thing that is covered and you have the thing that covers it, right? You have God as he is before he speaks and is concerned with the other, with the Zulas, and then you have God as he speaks in order to be involved in the other, in the Makabel, in the one that's listening, right? Neither of these divine modes or divine states or whatever you want to call them, neither of these two things is more godly than the other. God forbid. They're different. They're two different things, which is the first step to answering Eyal's question. They're two different things. Havaya and Elokim are two different names describing two different states of God, and yet neither is more godly than the other. And they can't be. Why? Because both of them come equally from God himself. It is the same God who is in a state of non-speaking, and the same God who is in a state who involves himself in the process of speaking, the process of bringing other things or other realities into being. The imkain, if so, einay shayach sheshum davar yastir al elokus klal. It cannot really be that anything conceals godliness at all. Again, you have to understand, you have to think. Nothing can conceal godliness. Okay, well, I see this table. The Siddur, maybe we'll make an exception. The Siddur reveals godliness in a different way, maybe. But let's say the table. The table that can't conceal godliness. It can't. We just said, nothing can conceal godliness at all. Right? Where's the godliness?
To God.
You can look at it, 1 second, there's different levels here. So 1 second. There's different levels. But if you come, bring a microscope, you bring a magnifying glass, you look at, observe this table all day, as many scientists would do, they don't find God. Right? Where is God hiding? Nothing can conceal God at all. So the first step is, Ronnie's right. First of all, we're only talking about from God's perspective. But even without that, even before we get to the difference between our perspective and God's perspective, which we'll start talking about more as we go later in the Maimer, even before you get to that, right? The point is not that the table has to look the same as Ora Ein Sof. The point is not that for the table not to conceal God, it has to not look like a table. It has to look like an infinite white light of God, right? Or seas splitting, or lightning bolts, or weird-looking angels, or all sorts of things like that, right? The point is that whatever the table may be, this is the point. This is why nothing can conceal godliness, right? Because whatever you are looking at, it's like the shell of the tortoise, right? The table doesn't have to be Or Ein Sof. The table can just be a table. The point is, the table cannot conceal over godliness because godliness is the only thing we have to work with. All the differences and all the concealment and all the finitude and all the limitation and all the darkness, what makes all of those things? Where do all of those things come from? They come from nothing other than God himself. We're monotheists. We don't believe there is any other source for anything else. Everything comes equally from God. So when we say etzem ein master al etzem, it's not that the table is not a table. That's not what we're saying, at least not yet. Not yet. We're not saying the table is not a table. We're just making this very simple point that the table can be whatever it is. Whatever that it is, it must be godly. Just like Or Ein Sof. Right? Nothing can conceal godliness at all because everything is equally godly in its original source. Where do you think the table got its whiteness and its plasticness and its solidity and its shape and its function and its location and its place and its its location in time as well? Where do you think all of these things come from? They're all functions of Shem Elokim. They all come through God speaking. And God speaking is just as godly as God before he's speaking. Right? In this sense, the table cannot conceal godliness. Even though, yes, it is plastic and it is white, and God has black as well. God has black as well, and the table is white. And God has metal as well, and the table is plastic. So how can I say the plastic doesn't conceal God? We mean it in the simplest sense possible. In fact, it's so simple that it's actually revolutionary. It's one of these things that you have to think higher than all the complicated thoughts to get to this simple thing. It's so simple that it's actually almost impossible to understand, right? In other words, we're just saying, you know why the table can't conceal God? Because what do you think the table's made of? Basically, that's what the table is.
Not only that, the table is finite, God is infinite.
Yeah,
That's it.
yeah, but no, but that's not true. That's not true. That's exactly the opposite of what we're saying. Very good. We're not saying that the table is not finite and God is infinite. That's exactly not what we're saying. We are saying, actually, that the infinite and the finite are equally godly. That's actually what we're saying. We're saying there's nothing about being finite that's less godly than being infinite. That's exactly what we're saying. That's a different way of saying Havaya v'Elokim kul echad. Elokim, which is the source of the finite, and Havaya, which is the infinite, or Ein Sof Baruch Hu, right? The infinite light of God. They're both equally godly. They're they're the same thing. They're exact opposites. They're not the same thing. They're opposites. But can any one of these opposites be said to come from somewhere other than God himself? And the answer is absolutely not.
That's why the must be expression of the same one. Because if God, Yud Kei Vav Kei is infinite,
Yeah.
and Elokim is also infinite, it's impossible. You cannot have two infinite
No, that's
things.
also true. That's also true.
But they're the same one. That's what it
They're the
says.
same one,
whole
that's what
other
I'm
thing.
saying.
The point is that God is not defined. A different way of saying what we're saying is that godliness is not defined by its infinitude. Godliness is not defined by being Havaya. A different way of saying what we're saying is that Havaya is also a name. Havaya is also a name. In other words, you think that God before he speaks is not more God than God when he speaks. Right? So in other words, God before he speaks is also just a name. It's also just something that's a state of Hashem, not Hashem himself. It's a different way of putting it, right? In other words, these two things to God are equal. They're both equally godly. They're equally godly, Elokim and Havaya, the finite and the infinite. And that's why nothing can conceal godliness, no matter how concealed it is. And in the table, it's very concealed. The concealment itself, the thing you're looking at, is godliness. The thing you're looking at that's meant to be hiding God is God. Just like when you're looking at the tortoise shell, the thing you're looking at is the tortoise. There's no separate thing here, right? This thing I'm looking at, which I can't see the tortoise at all, because the tortoise, all its limbs and everything are all inside this shell. It's saying, don't be a fool. You're looking at the tortoise. There's nothing here other than the tortoise. That's all you're looking at, right? That's the mashal. That's what we mean here. And therefore, nothing can conceal godliness at all. The imkain, if so, Einay shayach loymar sheshem elikim yasar alav chas v'shalom. You cannot say that the name elikim conceals God. God forbid. Shehare shem elikim hu b'chinas malchus. Because Shem Elokim, which is Malchus. Here we're going to talk about a little bit more about the nature of Dibur. God, we know, expresses himself in 10 spheres. Right? There's 10 fundamental building blocks of all divine expression. There's 10 ways God expresses himself to create the world. I'm keeping this as basic as possible. The 10th and the final of these 10 ways is called Malchus, is called kingship. When we were learning Tanya in this class, we spoke about Malchus a lot. There's a whole chapter of Shari Yichud V'Emunah, chapter 7, which the first half is all about Malchus. Really, the whole thing is all about Malchus, right? The divine kingship. This Malchus is the source of what we've been calling speech, right? Elokim is the Bechinas Malchus. Elokim is the Malchus in each situation. What we've been calling speech, God as he is in the act of speaking, the sphera of the 10 spheres to which this corresponds is Malchus. So now you have a very intuitive and not so difficult definition of Malchus, right? Of the 10 ways of divine expression, right? The 10 modes of divine expression. Malchus is the one where he's concerned with the Zulas, out of 10. Malchus is the one where it's God's expression to the other. That's why Malchus is the last of the 10 spheres, right? Because Malchus's job is to take the other 9 and express them outward. That's what Malchus's function is. It's the externalizing of all the spheres. It takes the complete 9 and it takes them and it externalizes them. It brings them down to the next level. So Malchus is the last of one level, and that gives over to Keser of the next level, which is everything is more complicated.
The others as well.
Of course.
So then there is Malchut in everyone.
Of course, there is Malchus in everyone.
But the expression
In each thing, the external expression of that thing is Malchus. So Malchus Shebechesed means Chesed, as it is expressing itself externally. And then Malchus itself gathers the Malchus Shebechesed and the Malchus Shebegvura, right, and the Malchus Shebechachma and the Malchus Shebebina. It takes all those Malchuses and expresses them outward in a way that even those Malchuses couldn't express them outward, if it makes you happy. So yes, Malchus is part of every level. It's the Bechinas Malchus of every level. Everything has a Malchus aspect, right? Everything has a sof. Everything has an end where it is expressing itself externally to a recipient. Right? This is the way God made the universe. This is one of the 10 spheres. So, what we've been calling Elokim, which is it's God as he is speaking. If you want to translate that into Spheros language, into more common Kabbalah language, you call that Spheros HaMalchus. That's God expressing his kingship. Why is it called kingship, by the way? Because we, generally speaking, have a principle called Ein Melech B'loi Am. Kingship is the trait that requires a nation. It requires something external to be the king over. You can't be a king over nothing, more or less. So you can't, within our reality anyway, you can't be a king over nothing. You need a nation over which to be a king. Ein Melech B'loi Am. There's no king without a people, no king without a nation. And therefore, the aspect of godliness which requires the zula, something else, to be its fulfillment, is called malchus, it's called kingship. Just as a king can only come into fruition and become himself in the zulas, in the other, in the nation over which he rules, so too Hashem has an aspect of kingliness, an aspect of kingship, the lowest of the spheres, which only reaches its full expression, which only reaches its consummation in others, in having a person to which to speak to, as Eyal would say. Malchus is that trait of speaking which requires a zulas, requires someone else to speak to. So, when Hashem is in a state of speaking, which is all about the zulas and the other, that's called malchus. And what is malchus? What is malchus? Malchus is one of the 10 spheres. What else would malchus be? Malchus is one of the modes of divine expression. In other words, hu elokus umeyuchad be'en seif betachlis hayichud. Malchus, just like the other 9 spheres, what is it? It's godliness, and it's absolutely united with Ein Sof. It's absolutely united with the infinite reality of Hashem, just like the other 9 spheres. This is for our Kabbalists we're explaining. The imkain ene master klal gam legabe ha'adam mishem havaya amhava elamus. It doesn't even conceal from the perspective of the ray of godliness which brings the world into existence. So, in other words, we'll finish here. 1 second. Make a mark where we finished. So, we explained how nothing can conceal godliness. Why can nothing conceal godliness? Because everything is godliness at the end of the day. Everything is the godliness it would seek to conceal. Right? There's nothing else with which to conceal godliness except godliness. So, therefore, even when you're looking at the table, and the table is not our Ein Sof, nevertheless, what is the table? The table is no less godly than our Ein Sof. That's what we were saying before we came into this whole Kabbalistic discussion of Malchus. Since there is no such thing as concealing godliness, since even that which we would use to conceal godliness is itself godly, and we now have a different name for it. What is the godliness that's used to conceal other godliness? It's called Malchus. That's the name of the godliness. That's what we call the divine mode of expression, whose function is to conceal other divine modes of expression. I don't want to get too complicated, but God, when he is concealing himself, and we've been calling it Elokim, or the divine speech, a different word for it is Malchus. A different word for it is Malchus.
A different word of God is revealed in that sphere.
Everything is more complicated than I'm saying. But a
concealed
different word for
in
that
that sphere
mode,
with
a different word for that mode, for Shem Elokim, is Malchus. So, therefore, from the perspective of God, this is all talking about from God's perspective, there is no concealment of godliness taking place at all, even relative to the godliness that is contracted, that is brought down through the divine speech to create each thing. In other words, not only does the divine speech not conceal God himself, the divine speech doesn't even cover over the godliness that is contracted to be involved in the divine speech. This is a slightly more abstract way of saying what we were saying last week and at the beginning of this week's class. In other words, not only does the divine concealment not cover over God himself, not only does Lo Shanisi mean God as he's up in the sky has not changed, right, so to speak, God as he is not involved in the process of creating. Lo Shanisi means even God as he is involved in the process of creating, right, as he is involved in speaking each thing into being, even that involvement does not constitute a change and a concealment to Hashem. And the answer, we now have the first step of the answer. Why? Because the very thing that would conceal or change godliness in such a case is itself godly. In other words, if the question is, it all depends what the question is. This is just the first step. If the question is from God's perspective, if God is saying, is my words when I say, let there be light, any less an expression of me than before I said anything, or even than before I say Yehi Rakia, which is the next divine utterance to create the firmament, right? When God says, let there be light, is that any less godly, right, than when God is doing nothing, right? And the answer is no. It's not any less godly. The very change, the very concealment we are going through, by bringing it into speech, by bringing it into this external mode of expression for the zulas, for the other, that very involvement is not any less godly. It's not any less elokus. It's not any less eloki than what God was doing before he did that. That is what we are saying in tonight's class. So if the question is simply, if change means being less godly, then there is no change taking place. If that's what change means.
But that's a big if.
What?
That's a big if.
Exactly. That's why this is only the first step. That's why this is only the first step. The first step is, if change means, is it any less godly, this act that I am involved in now? The answer is, it's no less godly. It's the same reality of godliness. Why? Because ein etzem master al etzem. A self cannot conceal a self. What I am looking at is a concealment of God, but what is he concealing himself with? What's the shell? What's the externalizing process? What's the Elokim he's using to conceal himself? It's all himself. It's all equally himself. This is him just as much as when he was revealed was him, so to speak.
I'm not satisfied with this answer.
Sorry?
I'm not satisfied with this answer.
Ronnie, if the class was based on your personal satisfaction, we would have given it up a long time ago. But this is the first step. The first step of a much longer explanation. We will, God willing, continue next week.